An ancient scroll hidden under a monastery's floor changed everything. Sir Thomas Blackwood, a battle-weary knight fallen from the king's favour, discovered the yellowed parchment during a routine patrol of the northern border. What followed wasn't just an agricultural revelation, but the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would transform a kingdom's understanding of wealth, power, and the very soil beneath their feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sir Thomas Blackwood hadn't slept for days. How could he? After years of loyal service to King Edward, he had been relegated to patrolling the barren northern reaches of Westoria, a punishment for speaking too freely during the royal council. The farmlands surrounding his modest family holding at Oakenshield were failing, the soil depleted after generations of farming the same way. Another poor harvest would mean starvation for his tenants and financial ruin for his family name. The morning dawned cold and grey over the rolling hills of Oakenshield. Thomas had been awake since before dawn, walking the struggling fields that had once been the pride of his family. At 42, his body still carried the strength of his fighting years, but new lines of worry had etched themselves around his eyes. His once polished armor now hung in the armory, replaced by simple leather and wool, more suited to a man who spent his days worrying over crop yields rather than battle strategies. "You're going to wear a path in that field if you keep pacing," called a familiar voice. Thomas turned to see his sister Eleanor approaching. Her practical dress and apron, a stark contrast to the fine, courtly gowns she had once worn as lady-in-waiting to the Queen. She had abandoned that position to return home when their father died, leaving Thomas, the unexpected heir, to lands he had never been trained to manage. "The winter wheat has failed again," Thomas said simply, gesturing toward patches of yellowish sprouts struggling through the hard-packed soil. "Third season in a row." Eleanor stood beside him, surveying the fields with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up watching their father manage the estate. At 38, she had her mother's practical mind and their father's stubborn determination, traits that had proven essential in these difficult years. "Marshal Wilson believes we should let the eastern fields lie fallow again," she said, mentioning their weathered farm steward. Thomas shook his head. "We can't afford to. The king's tax collectors won't accept excuses about fallow fields. They care about coin, not agricultural philosophy." A chill wind cut across the field, carrying the first hint of the coming winter. Thomas pulled his cloak tighter, remembering warmer days in the southern campaigns when he had served with distinction, before his outspoken criticism of the king's taxation policies had landed him in this rural exile. "Your patrol leaves tomorrow?" Eleanor asked, changing the subject. Thomas nodded grimly. "A week along the northern border, checking for Caldorian raiding parties that both of us know won't be there until spring." "The monastery falls along that route, doesn't it?" Eleanor asked, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "Perhaps you could speak with Brother Michael about his herb gardens. They always seem to thrive regardless of the season." Thomas had considered this himself. The monks at St. Clement's Monastery maintained the most productive gardens in the province, despite the poor soil and harsh climate. He had attributed it to divine favor, or perhaps just the abundance of hands available for careful tending. "It can't hurt," he agreed, "though I doubt Brother Michael will reveal secret monastic growing techniques to a disgraced knight." Eleanor fixed him with a stern look reminiscent of their mother. "You're still Sir Thomas Blackwood, knighted by the king himself after the Battle of Ravenfield. Your current standing at court doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished." Thomas managed a small smile. His sister's unwavering faith had been his anchor during these difficult years. "Always the diplomat, Eleanor. You should have been the one advising the king and miss all this excitement managing a failing estate," she replied with a wry smile. "Never. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A rider approached from the main road, bearing the royal insignia on his tabard. Royal messengers rarely brought good news these days. "Sir Thomas Blackwood?" The messenger called, reining in his horse. "I am he," Thomas replied, squaring his shoulders and instinctively standing straighter. The posture of a knight, not a struggling farmer. The messenger extended a sealed parchment. "From Lord Chamberlain Reynolds. The Northern Patrol schedule has been modified. You're to depart today and extend your route to include the villages beyond Frostwater Pass." Thomas accepted the message, breaking the seal to confirm the orders. Frostwater Pass? That adds 3 days to the journey, and the weather— "My orders were to deliver the message, not discuss its contents," the young man interrupted, already turning his horse. "Good day, Sir Thomas." As the messenger departed, Thomas unfolded the parchment fully. "This is Richardson's doing," he muttered, referring to Sir James Richardson, a court favourite who seemed dedicated to making Thomas's exile as uncomfortable as possible. "When will you leave?" Eleanor asked, practical as always. "Within the hour," Thomas replied, already calculating provisions and preparations. "I'll need to gather supplies for the extended journey." Eleanor nodded. "I'll have Marshall prepare your horse and pack food. Take the heavy winter cloak. There's still snow in Frostwater this time of year." As they walked back toward the modest manor house, Thomas found his mind turning again to the monastery gardens. Perhaps there was something to be learned there after all. Not that agricultural techniques would solve his immediate problems, but any advantage might help Oakenshield survive another year. What Thomas couldn't know, as he prepared for his patrol, was that this journey would change not just his fortunes, but the very future of the kingdom. The ancient scroll hidden beneath the monastery's stone floors had waited centuries for the right person to discover its secrets. And fate had determined that person would be a disgraced knight with soil under his fingernails and desperation in his heart. 2 hours later, Thomas rode north along the King's Road, the weight of his responsibilities temporarily left behind. The familiar rhythm of travel brought back memories of campaigns and adventures from his younger days. Despite the circumstances, there was freedom in the open road that the confines of a failing estate couldn't provide. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Thomas checked on the small villages under his protection, noting with concern their own struggling crops and hungry faces. The northern provinces had always been poorer than the fertile southern regions, but recent years had seen conditions worsen dramatically. On the third evening, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon promising heavy rain, the spires of St. Clement's Monastery came into view. The sight was welcome both for the promise of shelter from the coming storm and for the opportunity to observe the monks' gardens before continuing to the more distant outposts. Thomas had visited the monastery many times over the years, both as a representative of the crown and as a traveller seeking shelter. The brothers had always welcomed him warmly, but he wondered if his changed status at court would affect his reception. He need not have worried. Brother Michael himself met Thomas at the gate, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Sir Thomas, we had not expected you until next week." Come in, come in. There's a storm brewing that looks fierce enough to drown the devil himself." Thomas dismounted, handing the reins to a young novice who appeared at his side. "Thank you, Brother Michael. My patrol route was extended unexpectedly. I hope I'm not imposing." "Nonsense," the old monk replied, leading Thomas through the courtyard. "We always welcome defenders of the realm, especially those who have treated our humble order with such respect over the years." As they crossed the central courtyard, Thomas's eyes were drawn to the monastery gardens, visible through an arched passage. Even in the fading light, he could see the vibrant green of healthy plants, a stark contrast to the struggling fields of Oakenshield. Brother Michael followed his gaze. "Our evening meal is simple, but the vegetables are fresh from the garden. You've come at a good time. The spring plantings are doing exceptionally well this year. They always seem to, Thomas observed. Your order must have special blessings when it comes to growing things, the old monk chuckled. God's favor helps certainly, but so does knowledge passed down through generations. Perhaps during your stay, you'd like to speak with Brother Samuel. He oversees our gardens and has quite a gift for coaxing life from even the poorest soil. I would appreciate that greatly, Thomas replied, his interest genuine. My family's lands at Oakenshield have struggled these past seasons. Any wisdom would be welcome. Brother Michael's expression grew thoughtful. Times are difficult throughout the northern provinces. Too many fields work too hard for too long. He gestured toward the refectory. But such matters are better discussed over food and drink. Come, refresh yourself, and we'll speak more later. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The monastery refectory buzzed with quiet conversation as Thomas joined the brothers for their evening meal. Simple wooden tables arranged in neat rows filled the long hall, with an elevated table at the front for the abbot and senior brothers. The austere stone walls were softened by tapestries depicting biblical scenes of harvest and abundance, themes that resonated deeply with Thomas in his current circumstances. Abbot William Carson, a stern-faced man with intelligent eyes and a reputation for scholarly precision, acknowledged Thomas with a formal nod before addressing the assembled monks. We welcome Sir Thomas Blackwood of Oakenshield, who serves the crown by protecting our northern borders. Let us thank the Lord for his safe arrival before this storm. After a brief prayer, servants brought out simple fare, hearty vegetable stew, fresh bread, and small cups of the monastery's renowned blackberry wine. Thomas couldn't help noticing that the vegetables in his bowl, carrots, onions, and greens, were larger and more vibrant than anything growing at Oakenshield. You seem preoccupied with your stew, Sir Thomas, observed Brother Samuel, the garden master who had been seated beside him. Unlike many of the older monks, Samuel was perhaps only 30, with calloused hands and sun-browned skin that spoke of long hours working outdoors. I was admiring the quality of your vegetables, Thomas admitted. They put our efforts at Oakenshield to shame. Brother Samuel's eyes lit with interest. The northern soil presents challenges, certainly. How many seasons has your land been struggling? 3 years of poor harvests, Thomas replied, breaking apart a piece of bread. Though the decline began before that. My father, God rest his soul, noticed the weakening yields a decade ago. And how has your steward responded? Marshal Wilson follows the traditional methods. We rotate crops as our fathers did. Leave fields fallow when we can afford to. Spread manure in winter. Thomas shrugged. The same techniques used throughout the kingdom. Brother Samuel's expression remained neutral, but Thomas detected a hint of judgment in his silence. You disagree with these methods? Thomas prompted. It's not my place to criticize the practices of noble estates, Samuel replied diplomatically. Thomas leaned closer. I didn't ask about your place, brother. I asked about your opinion. My tenants face hunger if our next harvest fails. I have no pride to protect when it comes to farming techniques. The monk studied Thomas carefully before responding. Traditional methods work well enough in the fertile south, but northern soil has always been different. It requires different attention. Different how? Before Samuel could elaborate, Abbot Carson's voice cut through their conversation. Brother Samuel, I believe the kitchen gardens need checking. Before this storm arrives, perhaps you could attend to that now. Though phrased as a suggestion, the abbot's words carried the weight of a command. Samuel bowed slightly. Of course, Father Abbot. To Thomas, he added quietly, perhaps we can continue our discussion tomorrow. As Samuel departed, Abbot Carson moved to take the vacated seat beside Thomas. Up close, The abbot's face revealed the deep wrinkles of a man who frowned more often than he smiled. "Sir Thomas," he began formally, "while we welcome your presence, I must caution against distracting our brothers from their duties with agricultural curiosities." Thomas set down his spoon. "I meant no disruption, Father Abbot. I merely sought advice that might benefit my struggling lands." "Understandable, but the monastery's methods are developed for our specific needs and spiritual purposes," Carson replied smoothly. "They wouldn't translate well to secular estate management." Thomas felt a flash of irritation at the dismissal. "With respect, good harvests translate to fed people regardless of whether those people are monks or farmers." "Indeed," the abbot conceded with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But our priority must be maintaining our self-sufficiency to continue God's work. Brother Samuel tends to become overly enthusiastic about his gardening theories. I wouldn't want him filling your head with impractical notions." Thomas recognized the political maneuvering behind the abbot's words. He had navigated enough court intrigues to recognize when someone was hiding something. But why would monastery gardening techniques be treated as secrets? What possible advantage could there be in keeping such knowledge confined? "Of course, Father Abbot," Thomas replied, matching the older man's formal tone, "though I wonder why knowledge that could alleviate suffering would be considered impractical." A flash of annoyance crossed Carson's face before he controlled it. "The monastery has maintained its traditions for centuries, Sir Thomas. Not all knowledge is meant for all people. Some requires proper context and preparation." Further conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the stone building. The storm had arrived in full force, and moments later a novice rushed into the refectory, soaking wet. "Father Abbot," the young man called urgently, "the western cellar is flooding. The old drainage channels have failed." Abbot Carson rose immediately. "Excuse me, Sir Thomas. This requires my attention." To the assembled monks he called, "Brothers Lucas, Matthew, and John, come with me. The rest of you finish your meal and prepare for evening prayers." As the abbot hurried away with several monks in tow, Thomas noticed something unusual. The concerned glance exchanged between two elderly brothers seated nearby. One shook his head slightly, and both returned to their meals in silence. Curiosity piqued, Thomas finished his stew quickly and approached the elderly monks. "Forgive my intrusion, brothers. I'm Thomas Blackwood." "We know who you are, Sir Knight," the older of the two replied. His gnarled hands suggested years of physical labor despite his advanced age. "I am Brother Daniel, and this is Brother Robert. We were wondering when you might approach us." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You expected me to seek you out?" "Not specifically you," Brother Robert clarified, his voice barely above a whisper. "But someone who asks the right questions eventually, someone who notices what grows and what doesn't, and wonders why." Daniel nodded. "We've watched the lands around us struggle while ours flourish. It wasn't always thus. There was a time when all the northern provinces produced abundant harvests." "What changed?" Thomas asked, taking a seat across from them. "Knowledge was buried," Daniel replied cryptically, "deemed dangerous by those who feared its implications." Robert glanced nervously toward the doorway the abbot had used. "This isn't the place for such discussions. The western cellar will keep the abbot occupied for some time. If you truly wish to understand, meet us in the scriptorium after Compline. Prayers, come alone." Before Thomas could press for more information, the monks rose and shuffled away, leaving him with more questions than answers. The remainder of the evening passed slowly. Thomas attended Compline prayers with the brothers, observing the ritual with respectful distance. He noted that neither Brother Samuel nor the elderly monks who had invited him to the scriptorium were present, and Abbot Carson's face betrayed lingering concern about the flooding cellar. When the prayers concluded, Thomas made his way through the darkened corridors toward the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room where manuscripts were copied and stored. The rain continued to pound against the narrow windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the stone hallways. The scriptorium door stood slightly ajar, a faint light visible within. Thomas pushed it open cautiously, revealing a long room lined with writing desks and shelves of manuscripts. At the far end, brothers Daniel and Robert waited with brother Samuel, a single oil lamp casting long shadows across their serious faces. "Close the door," Daniel instructed without preamble. Thomas complied, then approached the three monks. "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me, but I'm confused by all this secrecy. What knowledge could possibly warrant such caution?" "The kind that challenges power," Samuel replied simply. "The kind that gives common people control over their own prosperity." Robert nodded. "For centuries, this monastery has preserved ancient agricultural techniques, methods that predated even the Roman occupation. Techniques our ancestors used to make these northern lands fertile and productive. If such techniques exist, why aren't they widely practiced?" Thomas asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Daniel sighed. "Because 2 centuries ago, during the reign of King Malcolm, the church declared these methods tied to pagan rituals. The manuscripts were ordered destroyed, the practices forbidden. But not all was lost," Samuel added, a hint of pride in his voice. "A few brothers here recognized the value of the agricultural knowledge, even if they rejected the pagan elements. They secretly preserved key manuscripts, passing the knowledge to trusted successors. And now you 3 maintain these secret gardens," Thomas concluded, beginning to understand. "We do," Daniel confirmed. "But Abbot Carson belongs to the traditionalist faction within the church. He tolerates our experimental garden beds because they feed the monastery well, but he would never approve of sharing these techniques beyond our walls. He fears the old accusations of paganism." "And what exactly are these miraculous techniques?" Thomas asked, still not entirely convinced. Samuel exchanged glances with the older monks, who nodded their approval. "It's not just one technique, but a system of understanding how soil lives and breathes. The ancient manuscripts speak of the soil as a kingdom unto itself, with tiny inhabitants too small for the eye to see. These invisible creatures transform dead matter into nourishment for plants." Thomas frowned. "This sounds like superstition, not farming. Judge by results, not by what you cannot understand," Robert countered. "Our garden produces 3 times what conventional methods yield, with less labor and improving soil over time, rather than depleting it. The key manuscript, the one that contains the most detailed instructions, was hidden when the church authorities came searching," Daniel explained. "Concealed beneath the floor stones of the western cellar." The cellar. "That's flooding tonight," Thomas realized, the pieces suddenly connecting. Samuel nodded grimly. "Exactly. The abbot doesn't know it's there, but the flooding threatens to damage or destroy it. We need to retrieve it before it's too late, and we need your help." Thomas studied the 3 monks, weighing their earnestness against the absurdity of their claims. His practical nature warred with desperation to save his lands and people. "Why involve me? Why not retrieve it yourselves?" "Because," Daniel said gravely, "the abbot has forbidden any of us from entering the cellar tonight, claiming it's too dangerous. But you, as an honored guest and knight of the realm, could plausibly go there, perhaps to offer assistance or assess the damage as a courtesy." "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked. Samuel met his gaze directly. "Then you return to Oakenshield with empty hands, and your people face starvation when the next harvest fails. Meanwhile, knowledge that could save them rots beneath floodwaters." Put that way, Thomas realized he had little choice. His oath as a knight bound him to protect the people, under his care. If there was even a chance these monks spoke the truth, he had to investigate. "Very well," he said finally. "Tell me exactly where to find this manuscript and what to look for." The three monks exchanged relieved glances, and Brother Samuel unrolled a rough floor plan of the monastery on the writing desk before them. "Here's where you need to go," he said, pointing to a marked location on the parchment. "And may God protect you, Sir Thomas, for you seek a truth that some would prefer remain buried forever." The monastery corridors lay silent and dark as Thomas made his way toward the western cellar. Most brothers had retired to their dormitories after Compline prayers, leaving only a few candles burning in wall sconces to guide nighttime travelers. The storm continued its assault, rain hammering against the stone walls, with occasional thunder punctuating the steady downpour. Thomas moved with the practiced stealth developed through years of military campaigns. The floor plan Brother Samuel had shown him was clear in his mind, down the main corridor, past the kitchen, through the small herb-drying room, and then down the narrow stairs that led to the western storage cellars. As he approached the stairwell, Thomas heard voices and pressed himself into a shadowed alcove. Two monks passed by, carrying empty buckets. "Never seen flooding this bad," one was saying. "The abbot thinks the old drainage channel has finally collapsed." "Will we be able to save the winter stores?" asked his companion. "Doubtful. The waters, already ankle-deep and rising. The abbot has forbidden anyone from going down until morning, when we can assess the damage properly." Their voices faded as they continued down the corridor. Thomas waited until they were well out of sight before approaching the stairwell. A wooden barrier had been placed across the entrance, with a crude sign warning of danger. He lifted it aside and descended the worn stone steps, one hand trailing along the damp wall for balance. The smell hit him first, the musty odor of disturbed earth mixed with the mineral scent of groundwater. As he reached the bottom step, cold water covered his boots. The cellar stretched before him, dimly illuminated by a single lantern someone had left hanging from a ceiling beam. Wooden shelves lined the walls, their lower portions already submerged. Sacks of grain, barrels of preserved vegetables, and wheels of cheese were stacked on the higher shelves, an impressive stockpile that testified to the monastery's agricultural success. Thomas waded carefully into the chamber, the water now reaching his mid-calf. According to Brother Samuel's instructions, he needed to locate the 6th support pillar, and then find the floor section directly between it and the eastern wall. The monks had marked it with a small cross etched into the mortar, subtle enough to go unnoticed unless someone was specifically looking for it. The lantern cast dancing shadows as Thomas counted the pillars. 1, 2, 3. He froze at a splashing sound from the stairwell. Someone else was coming down. Thomas quickly moved behind a stack of barrels, crouching low. Abbot Carson appeared at the bottom of the steps, holding a lantern high as he surveyed the flooded cellar with obvious dismay. He moved with purpose toward the far corner, where a large wooden chest sat partially submerged. Producing a key from within his robes, he unlocked the chest and began removing items. Not food stores, but what appeared to be scrolls and small, leather-bound books, which he placed carefully into a satchel. Thomas watched silently, realizing the abbot had his own secrets to protect from the rising water. After several minutes, Carson secured his satchel and retreated up the stairs, apparently satisfied that his treasures were safe. When the sound of footsteps faded, Thomas emerged from his hiding place and continued his search. 4th pillar. 5th, 6th, there it was. He waded to the eastern wall and began examining the submerged floor between the pillar and wall. The water made it impossible to see, forcing him to feel along the stone with his fingers. After several minutes of methodical searching, his fingertips found a small cross etched into the mortar. This was it. According to the monks, the stone block was designed to be removed with the proper application of pressure at specific points. Thomas pressed the corners in the sequence Samuel had described. Nothing happened. He tried again, applying more force. Still nothing. Frustration mounting, he leaned his full weight against the precise spots. With a soft grinding noise, the stone block shifted. Thomas worked his fingers into the small gap and lifted. The stone was heavier than he expected, requiring all his strength to raise it clear of the water and slide it aside. Beneath lay a small cavity lined with oiled leather to protect against moisture. Inside rested a cylindrical case made of polished wood, sealed with wax at both ends. Thomas lifted it carefully, relieved to find it dry despite the flooding. He secured it inside his tunic, replaced the stone as best he could, and made his way back to the stairs. He had almost reached the steps when a voice called from above. "Who goes there? The cellar is forbidden until morning." Thomas recognized Brother Lucas, one of the younger monks who had accompanied the abbot earlier. He thought quickly. "Sir Thomas Blackwood," he called back, deciding honesty was the simplest approach. "I heard about the flooding and thought I might assess the structural damage. I have some experience with water management from military fortifications." Lucas descended several steps, holding his lantern forward suspiciously. The abbot left clear instructions that no one was to enter. "My apologies," Thomas replied, beginning to climb the steps. "I meant no disrespect. I simply thought I might offer assistance as a guest of the monastery." Lucas seemed to relax slightly, but still blocked the way. "That's considerate of you, Sir Thomas, but the abbot will assess the situation properly in daylight." "Of course," Thomas agreed, acutely aware of the manuscript case pressed against his ribs beneath his tunic. "The damage seems extensive but not critical. The main support pillars remain sound." Lucas nodded, stepping aside to let Thomas pass. "I'll relay your assessment to the abbot. You should change into dry clothes before you catch a chill." Thomas thanked him and continued down the corridor, maintaining a measured pace until he was out of sight. Then he hurried toward the small guest chamber he had been assigned, his heart pounding with the weight of his discovery. Inside his chamber, he barred the door and carefully removed the cylindrical case. By lamplight, he examined the seals, both intact, the wax impressed with a symbol he didn't recognize. He hesitated, uncertain whether to open it or wait for the monks who had sent him on this mission. A soft knock at his door interrupted his deliberation. "Sir Thomas?" came Brother Samuel's whispered voice. Thomas unbarred the door just enough to confirm it was indeed Samuel, then allowed him inside. The monk's eyes immediately fixed on the case. "You found it," Samuel whispered, his face lighting with reverence. "Was it undamaged by the water?" "The cavity was dry," Thomas confirmed. "Is this what you were seeking?" Samuel nodded, reaching for the case with trembling hands. "This contains agricultural wisdom lost to most of the world for centuries." He broke the seals carefully and removed the end caps. From inside he withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with yet another wax emblem. "This is it, the Tractatus Agricultura Antiqua, the most complete record of the old methods." "And these methods do truly work?" Thomas asked, still skeptical despite his efforts. "Tomorrow I will show you our experimental garden," Samuel promised. "You'll see the proof with your own eyes." He hesitated, then held out the manuscript. "You should keep this safe. Tonight, the abbot would never search a knight's quarters, but he might grow suspicious of me after the flooding." Thomas accepted the ancient document with care. Why risk so much for farming techniques? Samuel's expression grew solemn. "Because this knowledge doesn't just improve crop yields, Sir Thomas. It changes the balance of power in the kingdom." He moved toward the window, gesturing for Thomas to join him. Through the rain-streaked glass, they could see the dark outlines of the monastery lands, and beyond them, the struggling fields of the surrounding countryside. "Look out there," Samuel said quietly. "What do you see?" "Farmland," Thomas replied. "Struggling farmland." "I see a deliberate pattern," Samuel countered. "The monastery's lands flourish while the common people and minor nobles like yourself face declining harvests. This creates dependence. The church and crown control food supplies, which gives them power over life and death, Thomas frowned. You suggest this scarcity is intentional? Not created, but maintained, Samuel clarified. Knowledge that could alleviate suffering is hidden, because abundance would shift power away from those who currently hold it. That's a serious accusation, Thomas said carefully. Is it? Samuel challenged. Consider how the kingdom functions. Peasants work land they don't own, surrendering most of their harvest in taxes and tithes. Minor nobles like yourself serve as buffers between peasantry and crown, but you too are kept dependent through taxation and military service. Thomas couldn't dismiss the argument entirely. His own situation at Oakenshield reflected exactly this pattern, struggling to meet the crown's demands while trying to ensure his people didn't starve. The manuscript contains more than farming techniques, Samuel continued. It contains the blueprint for self-sufficiency. If widely implemented, it would change who controls the kingdom's food supply. And that's why the church suppressed it? Political control? Samuel nodded gravely. 2 centuries ago, King Malcolm faced widespread rebellion in the northern provinces. The church helped him suppress it by declaring the ancient agricultural methods, which had made the north prosperous and independent, to be pagan practices. They burned books, executed practitioners as heretics, and replaced the old ways with inferior methods that ensured northern dependence on the crown. Thomas turned from the window, processing these revelations. If true, they reframed his understanding of the kingdom's history and power structures. His own family's declining fortunes weren't simply bad luck or poor management. They were the intended outcome of deliberate policies established generations ago. Rest now, Samuel advised, moving toward the door. Tomorrow I'll show you our experimental garden, and you can begin to understand what this manuscript truly offers. After the monk departed, Thomas sat on his simple bed, turning the ancient scroll over in his hands. Its weathered parchment had survived centuries of suppression, flooding, and secrecy to reach him now, when his need was greatest. Whether divine, providence, or mere chance had brought it to him, Thomas couldn't say. He secured the manuscript inside his saddlebag, then lay back staring at the ceiling as rain continued to pound against the monastery walls. Outside, beyond these stone barriers, his tenants at Oakenshield faced hunger and uncertainty. Noble title meant little when fields failed to produce, and tax collectors showed no mercy. For the first time in months, Thomas felt a stirring of hope. If the monk's claims proved true, if this ancient knowledge could truly revitalize his lands, perhaps Oakenshield might not only survive but prosper. And if Samuel was right about the broader implications, this manuscript represented something even more valuable than agricultural techniques. It represented freedom. Dawn broke with muted grey light filtering through the rain-streaked window of Thomas's chamber. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a silent mist that clung to the monastery grounds. Thomas rose early, having slept fitfully with the ancient manuscript hidden beneath his bed pallet. Before venturing out, he carefully wrapped the document in oiled leather and secured it in his saddlebag. The monastery was already stirring with activity. Brothers moved purposefully through the corridors, carrying buckets and mops to address the previous night's flooding. Thomas made his way to the refectory, where a simple breakfast of porridge and bread awaited the early risers. He had just taken a seat when Abbot Carson entered, his face drawn with fatigue. The abbot's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Thomas before he moved to the head table. Thomas concentrated on his porridge, avoiding eye contact while straining to hear the abbot's hushed conversation with one of the senior monks. Completely compromised, Carson was saying. The entire Western Foundation will need inspection. And the items you retrieved? Asked the other monk. Safe, thank God. But I worry what else might have been damaged. That cellar has stood secure. For 2 centuries, Thomas concealed his interest, eating methodically while considering the implications. The abbot clearly had his own secrets hidden in that cellar, perhaps records or artifacts the church deemed important. But had he discovered the missing stone and the cavity beneath it? His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Brother Samuel, who sat across from him with a steaming bowl of porridge. "Good morning, Sir Thomas," the monk said at normal volume, then added in a near whisper, "Walk with me to the gardens after breakfast. Bring your cloak. The morning is damp." Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly and continued his meal. 20 minutes later, he followed Samuel through the monastery's east gate into what appeared at first glance to be a typical kitchen garden. Rows of vegetables stretched in neat lines, herbs grew in dedicated beds, and fruit trees formed a protective boundary along the outer edges. "This is the conventional garden," Samuel explained as they walked along the central path. "Productive enough, but nothing extraordinary." They continued past a stone wall to a second, smaller garden area that appeared markedly different. Instead of straight rows, plants grew in curved patterns. The beds were raised with deep paths between them. Trellises supported climbing plants in spiral formations that Thomas had never seen before. "And this," Samuel said with evident pride, "is where we practice the ancient methods." The difference was unmistakable. The plants here stood taller, their leaves broader and deeper green. Vegetables grew in abundance, carrots with lush tops, cabbages twice the size of those in the main garden, pea vines heavy with pods. "These are the same varieties as in the conventional garden?" Thomas asked, crouching to examine a cluster of radishes that had pushed partially above the soil, their red shoulders gleaming. "The very same," Samuel confirmed. "The only difference is in how we prepare the soil and arrange the plantings." He guided Thomas to a compost heap at the corner of the garden. "This is where it begins. The ancients understood that soil isn't merely dirt. It's a living system." He dug his hands into the dark material, lifting a handful for Thomas to examine. Unlike the heavy clay soil common in the northern provinces, this was rich and crumbly, almost black in color. "We layer plant waste, animal manure, forest leaves, and specific herbs in precise ratios," Samuel explained. "The manuscript provides exact formulations for different soil types. As these materials break down, they create a substance the ancients called humus, the foundation of fertile soil." Thomas studied the material, noting the earthy smell and how it crumbled easily between his fingers. "This doesn't seem like revolutionary knowledge. Many farmers use manure and compost." Samuel's eyes lit with the passion of a teacher finding a receptive student. "The difference is in the understanding of why and how it works. The manuscript describes invisible creatures that transform dead matter into living soil. By creating the right conditions for these creatures, we multiply their effectiveness tenfold." He led Thomas to a raised bed where lettuces grew in concentric circles rather than rows. "Observe the planting patterns. The ancients recognized that plants in nature don't grow in regimented lines. They discovered complementary groupings, certain plants that strengthen each other when grown in proximity. Like companions," Thomas mused, remembering how his military units perform better when assembled with complementary skills. "Precisely," Samuel beamed. "Onions planted with carrots deter pests that would attack the carrots. Beans grown among corn provide support for climbing. Marigolds repel insects that would damage food crops." For the next hour, Samuel guided Thomas through the experimental garden, explaining principles that challenged everything Thomas had been taught about agriculture. They examined specialized tools designed to aerate soil without disturbing its layers. Samuel demonstrated how they directed rainfall through channels that prevented erosion while maximizing absorption. "And this," Samuel said, stopping before, "a bed filled with unfamiliar plants, represents perhaps the most important principle from the manuscript. These are not crops for harvest. They are grown specifically to be turned back into the soil. You grow plants just to destroy them? Thomas asked, perplexed. Not destruction, transformation, Samuel corrected. These plants, what the manuscript calls green manure, draw nutrients from deep in the earth through their roots. When turned into the soil before they seed, they release these nutrients for the following crops. Some even capture elements from the air itself, enriching the soil in ways that animal manure cannot. Thomas shook his head in wonder. Why would knowledge this valuable be suppressed? Samuel glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Because self-sufficient farmers are harder to control than dependent ones. Consider your own situation. At Oakenshield, when your harvests fail, you depend on the Crown's goodwill and the Church's charity. Your vulnerability ensures your compliance. The monk led Thomas to a small shed at the garden's edge, where various tools and clay pots were stored. From a hidden compartment beneath a workbench, he withdrew several small cloth bags. Seeds, he explained, handing them to Thomas. Varieties, developed over generations using the ancient methods. They produce plants that yield their own seeds true to type, unlike the hybridized strains that the Crown distributes, which must be purchased anew each season. Thomas accepted the bags, understanding their value went far beyond the modest cloth containers. You risk much to share these. The risk of keeping such knowledge confined is greater, Samuel replied solemnly. The ancients believed wisdom should flow like water. Restricted, it stagnates. Shared, it nourishes all it touches. They continued walking, circling back toward the monastery's main buildings. In the distance, Thomas could see brothers working to remove water-damaged stores from the western cellar. There's something I don't understand, Thomas said after a contemplative silence. If these methods are so effective, why haven't others discovered them independently? Why hasn't the monastery's success aroused suspicion? Samuel smiled sadly. Some innovations are too subtle to be observed without guidance. The manuscript doesn't just list techniques, it explains why they work, which allows for adaptation to different conditions. As for arousing suspicion, he gestured toward the conventional garden they were passing. We maintain this larger garden using traditional methods precisely to avoid questions. Our experimental garden is attributed to Brother Daniel's eccentricity, tolerated because it produces well enough to justify his peculiarities. As they approached the monastery gate, Samuel's expression grew serious. The abbot will be suspicious after last night's events. You should prepare to depart earlier than planned. Take the manuscript and seeds to Oakenshield, but tell no one. Their origin. Begin with small test plots away from curious eyes. And if the techniques prove successful, Thomas asked, expand gradually. Attribute improvements to conventional methods, better manure application, or favorable weather. The Crown's agricultural overseers rarely investigate improved yields too carefully. They care only for their portion of the harvest. Thomas nodded, understanding the need for discretion. I owe you a debt I cannot repay, Brother Samuel. Repay it by using this knowledge wisely, the monk replied. Not for personal gain alone, but for the betterment of those who depend on you. And perhaps, when the time is right, by sharing it with others who will do the same. As they passed through the gate, Thomas noticed Abbot Carson watching from an upper window, his expression unreadable. The abbot raised a hand in what might have been a blessing or a warning, then disappeared from view. The abbot suspects something, Thomas murmured. He always suspects something, Samuel replied with a hint of grim humor. It's his nature to seek hidden threats to church authority, but he can't stop what he can't prove. They parted ways in the courtyard, Samuel returning to his duties while Thomas headed toward the stables to prepare for his departure. As he walked, Thomas felt the weight of the manuscript in his saddlebag, a burden and an opportunity unlike any he had carried before. For the first time since inheriting Oakenshield, he felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. If the ancient techniques proved even half as effective as Samuel claimed, Thomas could transform not just his own lands, but potentially the lives of every tenant farmer under his protection. And if Samuel was right about the broader implications about why this knowledge had been suppressed, then the manuscript represented something beyond agricultural innovation. It represented a quiet revolution, one that would grow quite literally from the ground up. Thomas had just finished saddling his horse when he heard footsteps approaching the stable. He turned to find Abbot Carson standing in the doorway, hands folded within the sleeves of his robe, expression carefully neutral. "Departing so soon, Sir Thomas?" the abbot inquired. "I had thought your patrol would keep you with us another day at least." Thomas secured the last strap on his saddlebag, acutely aware of the ancient manuscript hidden inside. "The flooding has made parts of the monastery less hospitable, Father Abbot. I thought it best to continue my duties rather than burden your brothers during your recovery efforts." Carson stepped further into the stable, his sharp eyes taking in Thomas's preparations. "Most considerate, though I wonder if you might delay just long enough to break fast with me in my private quarters. There are matters I wish to discuss." The invitation was phrased as a request, but Thomas recognized the subtle authority behind it. Refusing would only heighten the abbot's suspicions. "Of course, Father Abbot, I would be honored." Carson's quarters occupied a small building adjacent to the chapel, simple by noble standards, but luxurious compared to the monks' dormitories. A fire burned in the hearth despite the mild spring morning, and the table was already set with bread, cheese and wine of noticeably higher quality than that served in the refectory. "Please, sit," Carson gestured to one of the wooden chairs. As Thomas complied, he noticed a familiar figure standing quietly in the corner. Brother Lucas, who had intercepted him in the cellar the previous night. "Brother Lucas tells me you took an interest in our flooded cellar last evening," Carson began without preamble, pouring wine into 2 goblets. Thomas accepted the offered drink, keeping his expression neutral. "As I explained to Brother Lucas, I thought my experience with water management might prove useful." "Indeed," the abbot nodded, breaking a piece of bread. "Most generous. Yet I find myself curious about what specifically drew you to the western cellar at such a late hour." "I heard the brothers discussing the flooding and sought to help," Thomas replied simply. "Is there some problem with my actions?" Carson smiled thinly. "No problem. Merely curiosity about coincidences. You arrive during a rare storm that floods our western cellar, the first such flooding in decades. You develop a sudden interest in our agricultural methods, and now you depart in haste." Thomas met the abbot's gaze steadily. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Father Abbot." "I imply nothing," Carson replied, sipping his wine. "I merely observe patterns. Just as I've observed Brother Samuel's unusual gardening methods for years, tolerating them as harmless eccentricity. But perhaps they're not so harmless if they've caught the interest of a knight of the realm." The tension in the room thickened. Thomas chose his words carefully. "I'm a landowner facing failing harvests, Father Abbot. Any agricultural improvement would naturally interest me." "Of course," Carson nodded. "Yet there are approved methods for improving yields, methods sanctioned by Crown and Church, and there are other methods once declared heretical for their connection to pagan beliefs." Thomas set down his goblet. "I follow the king's law and the Church's teachings, Father Abbot. I would not knowingly traffic with heresy." "Knowingly," Carson repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. "Many have been led astray unknowingly, Sir Thomas, even men of good character." The abbot rose and moved to a small writing desk. From a drawer he withdrew a folded parchment bearing the royal seal. "This arrived by messenger 3 days ago," he explained, returning to place the document before Thomas. "A directive from the Royal Agricultural Office. They've received reports of unusual growing practices in the northern provinces. practices that may violate the Edict of 1172 prohibiting pagan agricultural rituals. Thomas examined the document, noting the authoritative language and specific penalties listed for violations. His heart sank as he recognized the signature at the bottom, Lord James Richardson, the royal official who had been instrumental in his exile from court. All landowners and church properties are to report suspicious agricultural activities, Carson continued. Those found concealing or practicing forbidden methods face severe penalties, including confiscation of lands. Thomas maintained his composure, with effort. A prudent measure to protect the kingdom's spiritual welfare, I'm sure. Indeed, Carson agreed. Which is why I must ask directly, has Brother Samuel shared any unorthodox agricultural techniques with you during your stay? The moment stretched between them. Thomas could feel Brother Lucas's eyes boring into him from across the room, waiting for his answer. Brother Samuel showed me the monastery gardens, Thomas admitted carefully. We discussed conventional growing methods, nothing more. Carson studied him intently. Nothing about special composting techniques, unusual planting patterns, seeds that need not be purchased anew each season. The abbot's specific knowledge confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Carson knew far more about the ancient methods than he had initially let on. Nothing that would violate church teaching or royal edict, Thomas replied, maintaining eye contact. My interest is solely in improving yields at Oakenshield within approved practices. Carson's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. I see. Then you would have no objection if Brother Lucas inspected your belongings before you depart? Merely a formality, you understand? The royal directive requires thorough compliance. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The manuscript and seed bags were hidden in his saddlebags, wrapped in oiled leather. A search would certainly discover them. I would object most strongly, Thomas replied, allowing an edge of noble indignation to enter his voice. I am a knight of the realm, Father Abbot, not some common smuggler to be searched at whim. My belongings fall under the protection of my rank and the king's peace. Even kings must answer to God's law, Carson countered. If you have nothing to hide, I have my dignity, Thomas interrupted, rising to his feet, and the dignity of my office. I've broken bread under your roof as an honored guest. To subject me to search without cause violates ancient hospitality laws that even the church respects. The two men stood facing each other across the table, the conflict now nakedly apparent. Brother Lucas shifted uncomfortably in the corner, uncertain how to proceed. After a tense silence, Carson spoke again, his voice dangerously soft. You misunderstand me, Sir Thomas. I do not suspect you of wrongdoing. I merely seek to protect you from unwitting error. The penalties for possessing forbidden agricultural knowledge are severe, particularly for one already in disfavor at court. The threat was thinly veiled. Thomas recognized the leverage Carson was applying. His precarious political standing made him vulnerable. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Thomas replied stiffly. But I assure you, my conscience is clear. Now, with your permission, I must continue my patrol route. The king's business awaits. Carson made a small gesture of acquiescence, though his eyes remained cold. Of course, far be it from me to delay the king's business. He moved toward the door. Brother Lucas will escort you to your horse. Thomas followed, acutely aware of the manuscript pressing against his side with each step. The confrontation had confirmed what Brother Samuel had told him. The ancient agricultural knowledge was actively suppressed, not merely forgotten. The royal directive proved the crown itself participated in this suppression, threatening landowners who might discover or implement more effective growing methods. In the courtyard, several monks paused in their work to watch as Thomas mounted his horse under Brother Lucas's suspicious gaze. Of Brother Samuel, there was no sign, perhaps a deliberate absence to avoid association. As Thomas prepared to ride out, Abbot Carson appeared at the monastery gate. "A word of caution before you depart, Sir Thomas," he called. "The path you consider dreading has led many good men to ruin. The Church does not forbid practices without reason. Some knowledge, though seemingly beneficial, carries hidden dangers." Thomas looked down at the abbot from horseback, the elevated position a small but meaningful advantage in their final exchange. "My father taught me that knowledge itself is neither good nor evil, Father Abbot. Only its application determines its virtue." He gathered the reins. "I thank you for your hospitality and prayers." Carson's reply carried to him on the morning breeze as he rode through the gate. "Both will be essential in the days ahead, Sir Thomas, more than you know." The implied warning followed Thomas as he rode northward, supposedly continuing his patrol route. In truth, he planned to circle back toward Oakenshield as soon as he was safely beyond observation. The confrontation with Abbot Carson had made one thing abundantly clear. He would find no allies among church leadership in his quest to implement the ancient methods. As the monastery disappeared behind him, Thomas felt the weight of the manuscript against his side and the seed bags concealed in his saddlebags. These small items represented hope for Oakenshield's future, but also danger. If discovered, they could cost him everything: his lands, his title, perhaps even his life. Yet the risk seemed increasingly worthwhile. The abbot's determined suppression and the royal directive only confirmed the value of what he carried: knowledge. This carefully guarded must hold tremendous power, power that those in authority feared would upset the established order. Thomas urged his horse to a gallop, eager to put distance between himself and the monastery. Ahead lay days of careful travel, avoiding main roads and official checkpoints. Beyond that waited Oakenshield, where Eleanor would help him implement these forbidden techniques in secret, beginning the slow process of agricultural transformation. Landscape rolled past, struggling fields and thin-faced peasants working soil that yielded less each year. Thomas observed them with new understanding. Their hardship wasn't mere misfortune or divine punishment, as the Church often suggested. It was the deliberate result of suppressed knowledge and enforced ignorance. For the first time since being exiled from court, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that transcended personal ambition. This wasn't merely about saving Oakenshield anymore. It was about challenging a system built on artificial scarcity and controlled dependence. With each mile that carried him closer to home, Thomas's resolve strengthened. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them. The ancient wisdom would take root once more in northern soil, quietly, secretly, but inexorably. Thomas arrived at Oakenshield 3 days later, having taken a circuitous route to avoid main roads and potential encounters with Crown officials. The journey had given him ample time to reflect on the risks he was undertaking. Implementing forbidden agricultural techniques could cost him everything: his lands, his title, perhaps even his life if the Church chose to frame it as heresy, rather than mere regulatory violation. As he crested the final hill overlooking the estate, the sight of Oakenshield's struggling fields reinforced his resolve. Brown patches mottled what should have been vibrant green growth. The winter wheat stood sparse and yellowing in fields that had once produced abundant harvests during his father's time. Eleanor was waiting in the courtyard when he arrived, her face brightening at the sight of her brother returning safely. Thomas dismounted wearily, embracing her before handling the reins to a waiting stable boy. "You've returned early," Eleanor observed. "Was your patrol route shortened?" "Lengthened, actually," Thomas replied, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "But circumstances required a hasty departure from St. Clement's. We need to speak privately." Eleanor's expression grew serious, recognizing the urgency in her brother's voice. "Of course. Marshal Wilson has been asking about the eastern field. Rotation. We can use that as pretext for a private walk." Minutes later, they strolled along the eastern boundary of Oakenshield's lands, far from curious ears. Thomas related everything: the secret garden, Brother Samuel's explanations, the ancient manuscript, and finally the confrontation with Abbott. Carson de Eleanor listened without interruption, her analytical mind processing each revelation. When Thomas finished, she remained silent for several moments, eyes scanning the struggling fields around them. "You realize what you're proposing," she finally said. "Implementing these techniques isn't merely agricultural experimentation, it's direct defiance of both Crown and Church." Thomas nodded. "I do, but after seeing the results at the monastery, I'm convinced this knowledge could save Oakenshield, and not just our lands, but the people who depend on us." "Show me the manuscript," Eleanor requested. Thomas retrieved the cylindrical case from inside his tunic, where he'd kept it close during the entire journey. Eleanor examined the ancient parchment carefully, her eyes widening as she decoded the Latin text and studied the detailed illustrations. "This is extraordinary," she breathed. "The diagrams alone suggest an understanding of soil and plant relationships far beyond current practices." She looked up at her brother. "But implementing this would require significant changes to our farming approach. The risk of discovery is substantial," Thomas acknowledged, "which is why I needed your counsel before proceeding." Eleanor handed the manuscript back, her expression thoughtful. "We would need to start small, perhaps that unused parcel behind the old orchard. It's sheltered from view and fertile enough to provide a fair test." Thomas felt a surge of hope. He had expected resistance from his practical-minded sister, not immediate strategic planning. "You believe we should try, then?" "I believe we must," Eleanor replied, surprising him further, but not recklessly. She turned, gesturing toward the manor house visible in the distance. "While you were gone, 2 more families from the western hamlet requested permission to leave Oakenshield. The Miller family lost their youngest to hunger weakness last month. The situation worsens with each failed harvest." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility pressed down upon him. As Lord of Oakenshield, the welfare of these people rested in his hands. How would we implement these methods without arousing suspicion? The field workers would notice changes in practice. Eleanor's lips curved in a slight smile. "Dear brother, you've spent too many years in military encampments and royal courts. You've forgotten how information travels among common folk. Our tenants care little for church edicts or royal proclamations. They care about feeding their families. You suggest we tell them openly." "Not openly," Eleanor corrected. "Selectively. Marshal Wilson has been with our family since father's time. He can be trusted. Young Adam Cooper has a clever mind and strong back. We'll need both, and Widow Simmons knows more about local plants than anyone in 3 counties. Thomas considered her suggestions. "A small circle, then. But how do we explain the new methods to them? We can't risk exposing them to punishment if discovered. We tell them part of the truth, that you learned new growing techniques during your travels. No need to mention forbidden manuscripts or monastery secrets." Eleanor's practical nature was finding solutions where Thomas had seen only obstacles. "They'll follow your lead out of loyalty and desperation. Results will secure their discretion." They continued walking, passing a field where a tenant farmer struggled to break the hard soil with an aging plow. The man's gaunt face and the visible ribs of his draft horse testified to the harsh conditions facing Oakenshield's people. "There's another consideration," Thomas said quietly. "If successful, these methods wouldn't just improve yields. They would fundamentally change the balance of power between landholders like us and the Crown. Self-sufficient estates would be less dependent on royal favor." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Which explains the suppression. Knowledge that enables independence threatens those who rule through dependence." She paused, studying her brother's face. "Thomas, are you certain this is merely about agricultural improvement? Or does part of you see this as revenge against Those who exiled you from court? The question struck uncomfortably close to truth. Thomas had indeed felt a certain satisfaction imagining Lord Richardson's reaction if Oakenshield were to flourish while other estates continued to struggle. But his motivations ran deeper than personal vindication. It began with Oakenshield, he admitted, with saving our lands and people, but seeing how deliberately this knowledge has been suppressed, how artificial scarcity has been maintained, to control the northern provinces, I can't help but see broader implications. A dangerous perspective, Eleanor cautioned, one that could be construed as sedition if voiced openly. I don't seek to challenge the king's authority, Thomas clarified, only to restore prosperity to lands that have artificially been kept poor. Is that sedition? To desire that people need not hunger when solutions exist? Eleanor's expression softened. Of course not, but those who benefit from current arrangements might view it differently. She touched her brother's arm gently. If we proceed, we must be absolutely discreet. No written records of these methods. The manuscript must remain hidden. Our explanations for improved harvests must seem plausible within conventional understanding. Thomas recognized the wisdom in her caution. Agreed. We present any success as the result of traditional methods applied with greater diligence. Nothing revolutionary, merely incremental improvement. They had reached the small stream marking Oakenshield's eastern boundary. Beyond lay the lands of barren Thornfield, equally struggling under the same depleted soil conditions. There's one more thing to consider, Eleanor said, gazing across the boundary. If our experiments succeed, if these ancient methods truly restore our soil's fertility, what then? Do we keep this knowledge solely for Oakenshield while our neighbors continue to struggle? The question cut to the heart of Thomas's growing moral dilemma. Brother Samuel entrusted me with this knowledge on the condition that I would eventually share it with others who would use it wisely. Sharing increases the risk of exposure exponentially, Eleanor pointed out. Each person who learns these methods becomes another potential source of discovery. Yet hoarding knowledge that could alleviate suffering seems contrary to the very reason it was preserved, Thomas countered. The manuscript itself speaks of wisdom that should flow like water, nourishing all it touches. Eleanor sighed, recognizing the conflict between prudence and principle. Let us succeed first at Oakenshield before worrying about neighboring estates. One step at a time, brother. As they turned back toward the manor house, the decision crystallized between them. They would implement the ancient techniques in secret, beginning with small, hidden test plots before gradually expanding. They would form a trusted circle of essential workers, sharing only what was necessary. They would attribute any success to conventional explanations while quietly revolutionizing Oakenshield's agriculture. Most importantly, they would proceed with extreme caution, knowing that powerful forces would oppose their efforts if discovered. That evening, Thomas carefully transferred the ancient manuscript's most crucial information to smaller parchment pieces that could be more easily concealed. The original document he sealed in a waterproof leather pouch and hid beneath a loose stone in the manor's root cellar. As he worked by candlelight, copying detailed instructions for soil preparation and companion planting, Thomas felt a profound sense of purpose, unlike anything he'd experienced since his knighting ceremony years ago. This wasn't just about agricultural innovation. It was about reclaiming knowledge that had been deliberately taken from the people. Knowledge that could transform lives. Outside his window, a light rain began to fall on Oakenshield's thirsty fields. Thomas watched the droplets streak the glass, imagining a time when those fields might flourish again with crops grown according to the ancient wisdom. The path ahead would be dangerous, but the alternative, continuing the slow decline into poverty and hunger, was unacceptable. The decision was made. Come morning they would begin. Dawn broke with golden light spreading across Oakenshield's eastern fields. Thomas stood in the secluded plot behind the old orchard, the first test site for the ancient methods. With him were the three people Eleanor had identified as essential to their endeavor: Marshall Wilson, the weathered farm steward; Adam Cooper, a young tenant farmer with innovative instincts; and Widow Simmons, a herbalist whose knowledge of local plants was unmatched. "You're certain this will work, my lord?" Marshall asked skeptically, examining the unusual trench system. Thomas had instructed them to dig the previous day. Unlike conventional furrows that ran in straight lines, these followed the natural contours of the land, designed to capture and slow rainwater. "Not certain," Thomas admitted honestly, "but I've seen similar methods succeed elsewhere. The northern soil requires different approaches than those used in the south." Widow Simmons knelt beside one of the trenches, crumbling the soil between. Her gnarled fingers. "This earth is dead," she pronounced. "No life in it after years of the same crops, drawing the same strength." "That's what we intend to change," Thomas explained, opening one of the seed bags Brother Samuel had given him. "Today, we'll plant these green manure crops, not for harvest, but to rejuvenate the soil itself." Adam Cooper studied the unfamiliar seeds with interest. "What manner of plants are these, my lord? I've not seen their like before." "Plants that draw strength from the air itself," Thomas replied, carefully avoiding direct mention of the manuscript's explanations about nitrogen fixation. "When they reach flowering stage, we'll turn them back into the soil rather than harvesting them." Marshall's eyebrows rose. "Grow crops just to plow them under? Begging your pardon, my lord, but that seems wasteful when people are hungry." "It may seem so initially," Thomas acknowledged, "but these sacrificial crops will allow future plantings to yield 3 times the normal harvest. Sometimes we must invest what little we have to gain abundance later." As the sun climbed higher, Thomas directed the unusual planting. Following the manuscript's instructions, they sowed the green manure seeds in specific patterns. Between these rows, they planted herbs that Brother Samuel had identified as soil enhancers, plants whose roots would break up compacted earth and draw up minerals from deeper layers. "The technique requires all parts working together," Thomas explained as they worked. "Like a well-trained military unit, each element supports the others." By midday, the test plot was sown according to the ancient patterns. Thomas then led them to the compost area he and Eleanor had begun preparing, based on the manuscript's precise formulations, layered organic materials in specific ratios. "This will become our most valuable resource," he explained, demonstrating how to turn the developing compost with a specialized fork he'd had the blacksmith create. "We'll apply it sparingly but strategically, where plants need it most." Widow Simmons examined the compost mixture with professional interest. "You've included nettles and yarrow," she observed. "Old wisdom there. My grandmother spoke of their strength for soil," Thomas nodded, encouraged by her recognition of elements that aligned with local tradition. "Sometimes old knowledge proves wiser than new. We're combining proven local practices with techniques I learned during my travels." This careful framing, presenting the ancient methods as a blend of traditional wisdom and foreign techniques, was deliberate. It provided plausible explanation for their unusual approach without revealing its true origin. As the days passed, Thomas expanded their core group to include Eleanor's trusted handmaiden Martha, who proved adept at recording observations in a coded system they had developed. Young Adam's wife Sarah joined as well, her sharp eyes noticing subtle changes in the test plots that others missed. 2 weeks after the initial planting, the results were already noticeable. The green manure crops had germinated with surprising vigor, pushing through soil that had previously seemed too depleted to support growth. The herb planting stood strong despite minimal rainfall. "It's working," Eleanor observed one evening as she and Thomas inspected the test plot. "But we must be careful. Success brings its own risks." She was right to be cautious. That very morning, A royal tax assessor had arrived unannounced at Oakenshield, conducting what he claimed was a routine evaluation of agricultural assets. Thomas had directed him to the main fields, carefully avoiding any mention of the experimental plot hidden behind the orchard. "Did he seem suspicious?" Thomas asked. "Not of our farming practices," Eleanor replied. "But he asked pointed questions about your patrol route, specifically whether you had spent time at St. Clement's Monastery." Thomas frowned. "Abbot Carson works quickly. He must have reported his suspicions to church authorities, who then alerted the Crown." "All the more reason to maintain absolute secrecy about what we're doing," Eleanor warned. "We'll need a convincing explanation when these methods begin showing results beyond our test plots." Thomas had been considering this problem. "We'll attribute improvements to traditional techniques applied with greater diligence, better drainage, more careful crop rotation, improved manure management. Nothing revolutionary, merely refinement of accepted practices." As spring advanced into early summer, they gradually expanded their implementation of the ancient methods. Small test plots appeared in hidden corners of Oakenshield's lands, each demonstrating the same remarkable results. The core group grew to include trusted representatives from each tenant family, all sworn to secrecy, but eager to apply techniques that showed such promise. Thomas adapted the ancient knowledge to Oakenshield's specific conditions, drawing on Marshall Wilson's lifetime of experience with the local soil. They developed systems for capturing rainwater in storage ponds, constructed to resemble ordinary livestock watering holes. They established composting areas disguised as simple manure heaps, but actually functioning according to the manuscript's precise instructions. Most importantly, they began cultivating the specially adapted seed varieties Brother Samuel had provided, plants bred over generations to thrive in northern conditions while producing their own viable seeds for future plantings. This independence from the Crown's seed distribution system represented perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of their approach, but also the most dangerous if discovered. Through it all, Thomas maintained his official duties, conducting patrol, routes, and attending regional administrative meetings. At one such gathering, he encountered Baron Thornfield, whose lands bordered Oakenshield to the east. "Blackwood," the Baron acknowledged with minimal courtesy. Like many nobles, Thornfield had distanced himself when Thomas fell from royal favor. "Your western tenant hamlets look marginally less miserable than last season. Found some new source of manure, have you?" "Simply applying traditional methods with greater care," Thomas replied with practiced modesty. "Nothing revolutionary." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it contained," Thornfield growled. "I've had 3 families attempt to flee my lands for yours this month alone, claimed they heard Oakenshield farm workers were actually getting enough to eat." Thomas concealed his surprise at this news. "Merely rumors, I'm sure, though all are welcome to petition for tenancy according to the old laws." The exchange confirmed what Thomas had hoped. The improved conditions at Oakenshield were becoming noticeable, but hadn't yet aroused dangerous levels of curiosity. The slow, measured implementation of the ancient techniques was allowing their effects to appear gradual rather than sudden. By midsummer, the time came for the first true test of the manuscript's methods. The green manure crops had reached their flowering stage in the original test plot, standing chest-high and vibrant with life. According to the ancient instructions, this was the precise moment to turn them back into the soil, when their nutrient content was highest. Thomas gathered their core group at dawn for this crucial step. "What we do today may seem counterintuitive," he explained. "These plants appear valuable enough to harvest, but their greater value lies in what they will give back to the soil. Using specially designed plows that cut and turned the plants without inverting soil layers, they carefully incorporated the green growth back into the earth. The manuscript had been explicit about this technique. Conventional ploughing that brought deeper soil to the surface disrupted the natural layers vital to soil health. "Now we wait 7 days," Thomas instructed. "The plants will transform beneath the soil, releasing their strength into the earth. Then we plant the main crop according to the patterns I'll show you." As the group dispersed to their regular duties, Adam Cooper lingered behind. The young farmer had proven particularly receptive to the ancient methods, often intuiting their purpose before Thomas explained it. "My lord," he began hesitantly. "What we're doing here, it's more than just better farming, isn't it?" Thomas studied the young man carefully. "What makes you ask that, Adam?" "These methods," Adam gestured toward the freshly turned field, "they don't just grow better crops. They free us from dependence, with seeds that renew themselves and soil that strengthens rather than weakens each season." He trailed off, perhaps concerned he had spoken too boldly. "Go on," Thomas encouraged. "It seems to me, my lord, that such practices might not be welcome to those who profit from our dependence. Seed merchants, grain traders, tax collectors who justify their levies by offering relief when harvests fail." Thomas was impressed by the young farmer's perception. "You have an uncommon mind, Adam Cooper. You see beyond the immediate to the broader implications." "Is that why we work in secret?" Adam asked directly. "Because these methods threaten more than agricultural tradition." Thomas placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Knowledge is power, Adam. Some wish to control that power by controlling knowledge itself. Remember that as we continue this work." Adam nodded solemnly. "I understand, my lord, and I'll guard these secrets with my life, not just for myself, but for my son yet unborn. Sarah told me just yesterday, we're to have a child come winter." "Congratulations," Thomas said warmly. "God willing, your child will grow up in an Oakenshield, where hunger is but a distant memory." As Adam departed, Thomas remained in the field, considering how quickly their circle of trust had grown and how deeply invested each member had become in the success of their experiment. What had begun as a desperate gamble to save Oakenshield was evolving into something more profound, a quiet revolution sown in soil and nurtured by hope. Autumn painted Oakenshield's landscape with amber and gold as the first true harvest from the ancient methods approached. The test plots, once small and hidden, had gradually expanded to encompass nearly a quarter of the estate's arable land. The results exceeded even Thomas's hopeful expectations, where conventional fields struggled to produce stunted crops. The areas cultivated according to the manuscript's guidance flourished with abundance. Wheat stood tall and golden, its heads heavy with grain. Root vegetables grew to twice their usual size. Fruit trees that had barely produced in recent years now bent under the weight of their bounty. Thomas walked the main path connecting the tenant hamlets, noting with quiet satisfaction how the gaunt faces of spring had filled out as food became more plentiful. Children played with newfound energy. Even the livestock showed improvement, thriving on the nutrient-rich fodder grown in the rejuvenated fields. "Sir Thomas," a voice called from a nearby cottage. Martha, Eleanor's handmaiden who had become an essential record-keeper for their agricultural experiment, hurried toward him. "Lady Eleanor requests your presence at the manor urgently." Thomas quickened his pace, concern rising at the unusual summons. "Is something wrong?" "Visitors, my lord," Martha replied, keeping her voice low despite the empty path. "Royal officials. They arrived without warning not half an hour ago." Thomas's heart sank. The success of their harvests had been impossible to hide completely, especially as they expanded implementation of the ancient methods. He had known scrutiny would come eventually, but had hoped for at least another season to firmly establish the new practices. "How many? Who leads them?" he asked as they walked briskly toward the manor house. 3 officials with the royal seal. 6 armed guards. Martha reported. The leader called himself Gordon Reynolds, Royal Agricultural Overseer for the Northern Provinces. Thomas controlled his expression with effort. Reynolds was known for his zealous enforcement of agricultural regulations and close ties to Lord Richest, Thomas's political adversary at court. His presence at Oakenshield was unlikely to be coincidence or routine inspection. Find Marshall, Wilson and Adam Cooper, Thomas instructed. Tell them to ensure all copies of our special planting diagrams are secured, and to direct any questions about our methods to me alone. Martha nodded and hurried away on her mission as Thomas continued. To the manor house. He took a moment outside the main door to compose himself, setting his features in the neutral expression he had perfected during his years at court. Inside the great hall, Eleanor was entertaining the visitors with practiced hospitality. Wine had been poured, bread and cheese laid out. The royal officials, all wearing the dark blue tunics that marked their office, stood examining a large map of Oakenshield's lands spread across the main table. "Ah, my brother returns," Eleanor announced, relief visible in her eyes despite her composed demeanour. "Sir Thomas, may I present Master Gordon Reynolds, Royal Agricultural Overseer, and his associates, Masters Phillips and Harrington." Thomas offered the formal bow appropriate to their stations. "Welcome to Oakenshield, gentlemen. I apologize for not being present upon your arrival." Reynolds was a corpulent man with calculating eyes that belied his jovial appearance. "No apology necessary, Sir Thomas. Your sister has been most accommodating." He gestured to the map. "We were just discussing the remarkable reports of Oakenshield's improved harvests this season." Thomas maintained an expression of modest pride. "We have been blessed with favorable conditions this year." "Indeed," Reynolds smiled without warmth. "Most remarkable, considering every other estate in the northern provinces reports continued struggles. Your neighbours to the east, Baron Thornfield's lands, show harvest projections 40% below average, yet Oakenshield apparently expects yields significantly above average. We've implemented stricter management practices," Thomas explained smoothly. "Better drainage systems, more precise crop rotation, improved manure application." Reynolds nodded, as if accepting this explanation, though his eyes remained skeptical. "Commendable initiative. The Crown always appreciates landholders who maximize productivity and tax revenue." He rolled up the map decisively. "We'll need to conduct a thorough inspection of your fields and methods, of course. Standard procedure when results deviate so dramatically from regional norms." "Of course," Thomas agreed with outward calm. "Though harvest is imminent in many fields, I wouldn't want your inspection to delay critical work." "We'll try not to interfere unduly," Reynolds assured him with false solicitude. "My men are experienced in agricultural assessment. They can examine fields without disrupting harvest preparations." His tone hardened slightly. "We'll begin immediately, if you don't object." It wasn't a request. Thomas exchanged a brief glance with Eleanor, whose slight nod confirmed she had already taken precautions during the official's arrival. "I would be happy to accompany you personally," Thomas offered, hoping to control which fields they examined first. "No need to trouble yourself," Reynolds countered. "Your steward, Marshall Wilson, I believe, can guide my associates. I'd prefer to discuss certain matters with you privately." The strategy was clear: separate Thomas from the inspection to prevent him from managing what the officials would see. Meanwhile, Reynolds would occupy Thomas with questions, perhaps hoping to catch him in contradictions. "As you wish," Thomas conceded, having little choice. "Eleanor, would you ask Marshall to assist our guests?" As Eleanor departed to find the steward, Reynolds dismissed his associates with instructions to begin their inspection. When they were alone, except for the silent royal guards positioned by the doors, Reynolds's demeanour changed perceptibly. "Let us speak plainly, Sir Thomas," he began, helping himself to more wine. "Your fall from favour at court is well known. Your outspoken criticisms of royal taxation policies were most unwise." Thomas remained silent, recognizing the approach as one designed to provoke defensive responses. "Yet here you are," Reynolds continued, "transforming a struggling estate into a productive holding in a remarkably short time. One might wonder what resources or techniques you've suddenly acquired." "As I explained, we've simply improved our implementation of traditional methods," Thomas replied evenly. Reynolds smiled thinly. "A convenient explanation. Yet I've reviewed reports from your neighbors. They describe unusual planting patterns visible from boundary roads, unfamiliar crops grown and plowed under before maturity, curious composting structures unlike conventional manure management systems." Thomas maintained his composed expression despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. They had been observed more carefully than he'd realized. "Experimentation within traditional frameworks is not forbidden," Thomas pointed out. "Many landholders try different approaches to improve yields." "True," Reynolds acknowledged, "though some experiments stray into prohibited territory." He withdrew a folded document bearing the royal seal. "Are you familiar with the Agricultural Practices Regulation Act of 1172? "I am." "Then you know it. Explicitly forbids certain growing methods associated with pagan traditions." Reynolds unfolded the document. "Including, but not limited to, circular or spiral planting patterns, the cultivation of crops specifically for soil incorporation rather than harvest, and the use of non-certified seed varieties." Thomas felt cold dread spreading through him. Every prohibited practice Reynolds listed was fundamental to the ancient methods they had implemented. The royal official was not making vague accusations. He had specific, accurate information about their activities. "These regulations exist for good reason," Reynolds continued. "Unapproved agricultural practices can damage soil, spread plant diseases, and undermine the Crown's careful management of food supplies." "My understanding," Thomas replied carefully, "was that these regulations primarily concerned ritualistic practices associated with the old religions, not practical growing techniques themselves." Reynolds's eyes narrowed. "An interesting interpretation. One might wonder where you acquired such a specific understanding of laws few landholders examine closely." He leaned forward. "Perhaps during your recent extended stay at St. Clement's Monastery." The direct reference to Thomas's visit confirmed his worst fears. Abbot Carson had indeed reported his suspicions, and the Crown had been investigating. Oakenshield specifically, not merely conducting routine oversight. "The monastery's hospitality during my patrol route was appreciated," Thomas acknowledged neutrally, "though brief rather than extended. Yet long enough, apparently, to acquire certain ideas." Reynolds set down his wine cup with deliberate precision. "I'll be direct, Sir Thomas. We have reason to believe you've obtained and implemented farming techniques explicitly forbidden by royal edict, techniques preserved by certain elements within the monastery despite church directives to destroy such knowledge," Thomas maintained, his outward calm while his mind raced through options. Denial seemed pointless given the specificity of Reynolds's accusations. Yet confession would mean disaster, not just for himself, but for everyone involved in implementing the ancient methods. "At Oakenshield, these are serious allegations," Thomas replied. "What evidence supports them?" Before Reynolds could answer, commotion erupted outside the hall. The door burst open as one of Reynolds's associates rushed in, his fine tunic stained with soil. "Master Reynolds," the man exclaimed, "you must see this immediately. The soil in the eastern fields, it's unlike anything in our records. And the planting patterns, they match exactly the prohibited diagrams from the 1172 edicts." Reynolds' face darkened with triumph as he turned back to Thomas. "It seems we have our evidence, Sir Thomas. As Royal Agricultural Overseer, I hereby Declare Oakenshield under Crown investigation for violation of agricultural regulations. He gestured to the guards. Sir Thomas is to remain within the manor house until further notice. As the guards moved to flank him, Thomas realized the gravity of his situation. The careful implementation, the secrecy, the plausible explanations, all had failed to protect them from discovery. The ancient knowledge that promised salvation for Oakenshield had now placed everything at risk. Through the open door, Thomas could see Eleanor returning with Marshal Wilson. Their faces reflected alarm as they observed the guards taking positions. Around Thomas, beyond them in the courtyard, more royal guards were arriving, far more than had accompanied Reynolds initially. This was no routine inspection. It was a planned operation based on specific intelligence. The question was no longer whether they could conceal their use of the ancient methods, but whether they could survive the consequences of their discovery. 3 days had passed since the royal officials had placed Thomas under house arrest. Oakenshield Manor bustled with unwelcome activity as Reynolds and his men conducted thorough inspections of every field, questioned every tenant farmer, and confiscated farming implements they deemed suspicious. Guards posted at every door ensured Thomas could not interfere or escape. From his study window, Thomas watched royal scribes cataloguing the abundant harvest from fields cultivated using the ancient methods. The irony was bitter. The very success they had achieved now served as evidence against them. He could see Eleanor in the courtyard, maintaining a dignified composure as she answered yet another round of questions from Master Phillips. A firm knock at the study door preceded the entrance of Reynolds, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. "Our investigation is nearly complete, Sir Thomas," Reynolds announced, settling himself uninvited in a chair. "I must say, the extent of your violations exceeds even our initial suspicions." Thomas remained, standing, unwilling to give Reynolds the satisfaction of appearing comfortable in his presence. "Have you found anything beyond agricultural innovations that produced abundant food for hungry people?" Reynolds' smile tightened. "Your innovations, as you call them, directly contravene royal edicts established for the kingdom's protection. We've documented 17 distinct violations, including implementation of spiral planting patterns, use of non-approved seed varieties, and cultivation of prohibited green manure crops." He opened his portfolio, revealing detailed sketches of Oakenshield's fields, along with samples of seeds carefully preserved in small cloth bags. "Most damning, however, is this." He produced a parchment that Thomas recognized with dread. One of the copied pages from the ancient manuscript that they had apparently failed to secure. This document contains agricultural instructions matching known pagan practices officially eradicated 2 centuries ago. Possession alone constitutes sedition. Implementation. Reynolds shook his head with feigned regret. "That approaches heresy." Thomas maintained his composure, despite the gravity of the accusation. "There is nothing heretical about composting techniques or companion planting. These are practical methods, not religious rituals. The Church and Crown determined otherwise long ago," Reynolds countered dismissively. "The distinction you attempt to draw was rejected in the Ecclesiastical Court of 1172. The methods themselves were deemed inseparable from their pagan origins." "And yet they work," Thomas observed quietly. "They restore fertility to depleted soil. They produce abundant food where scarcity once prevailed. Does that not suggest the original ruling might have been in error?" Reynolds's expression darkened. "Questioning established doctrine compounds your offense, Sir Thomas. I had thought mere ambition drove your actions. A disgraced knight seeking to restore his standing through agricultural success. Now I wonder if your motivations run toward more dangerous territory." A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Royal guards were escorting Adam Cooper across the courtyard, his hands bound, his young wife Sarah following in distress. Thomas felt a surge of protective anger. "Your quarrel is with me, Reynolds. My tenants followed my direction without knowing its controversial nature." "Young Cooper has been particularly forthcoming under questioning," Reynolds replied coldly. He admitted to understanding the broader implications of these methods, how they might undermine established systems of agricultural control. That makes him an accomplice rather than a mere follower. Thomas controlled his expression with effort. Adam's perceptiveness, which Thomas had admired, now endangered the young farmer. Before he could respond, Eleanor appeared at the study door. "Master." "Reynolds," she addressed the royal official with rigid formality. "Lord Richardson's party has arrived." Thomas's stomach tightened at the news. James Richardson, his political adversary at court and the architect of his exile, had come personally to witness his downfall. Reynolds rose with obvious satisfaction. "Perfect timing. Lord Richardson will want a full accounting of our findings before we begin dismantling these prohibited agricultural systems." He gathered his documents. "Enjoy your remaining hours at Oakenshield, Sir Thomas. By this time tomorrow, the estate will be under Crown administration pending formal confiscation." After Reynolds departed, Eleanor closed the door and moved quickly to Thomas. "It's worse than we feared," she said in a hushed voice. "They're arresting anyone who admitted knowledge of the special techniques. Marshal Wilson, Widow Simmons, 5 tenant farmers so far." Thomas pressed his palms against the desk, the weight of responsibility crushing down upon him. "I've led them all to ruin." "There's more," Eleanor continued urgently. "Richardson brought church officials with him, representatives from the Bishop of York. They're calling for formal heresy charges, not merely agricultural violations. Heresy charges would mean not just loss of lands, but potential execution. Thomas had known the risks when he implemented the ancient methods, but he had never imagined the church would escalate to such extremes. "What of the manuscript?" he asked. "The original? Still secure in the root cellar, as far as I know. They've been focusing on the fields and questioning the workers." A knock at the window startled them both. Thomas moved cautiously to investigate and found young Adam's brother, Michael Cooper, crouching on the narrow ledge outside. "My lord," Michael whispered as Thomas opened the window. "The passage beneath the old north wall is still unguarded. The royal men don't know about it. The ancient smuggler's tunnel had been sealed for generations, its entrance concealed behind the wine racks in the deepest part of the cellar. Thomas had shown it to Adam for emergency use only weeks before, never imagining they would need it so soon." "How did you—" Thomas began. "Adam told me before they took him," Michael explained quickly. "Said to tell you there's a boat waiting at Raven's Cove. Widow Simmons's son will take you downriver to the coast." Thomas exchanged a glance with Eleanor, the unspoken question evident in his eyes. "Go," she urged. "They'll execute you if you stay, and all our work will have been for nothing." "I won't abandon everyone who trusted me," Thomas protested. "Your death won't save them," Eleanor countered pragmatically, "but your escape might. Take the manuscript, preserve the knowledge they seek to destroy, find allies who can help restore what we've begun here." Thomas recognized the wisdom in her advice, however bitter. The ancient agricultural knowledge was bigger than Oakenshield, bigger even than the tenants currently suffering for their part in its implementation. If the manuscript were destroyed and all who understood its methods executed, the knowledge might be truly lost forever. "What of you?" he asked his sister. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "As a woman, they'll likely spare me the most severe punishments. I'll claim ignorance of the methods forbidden nature, that I merely followed your instructions without understanding their significance." "Richardson won't believe that." "Perhaps not," she acknowledged. But, unlike you, I've committed. No previous offences against the crown. My gender and status should protect me from the worst consequences. Michael Cooper glanced nervously over his shoulder. The guard patrol returns in minutes, my lord. We must go now if we're to go at all. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas embraced his sister fiercely. I'll find a way to make this right, he promised. Go to the Western Territories, Eleanor whispered, beyond the reach of Richardson's influence. The soil there has not been depleted by centuries of mismanagement. The ancient methods could transform those lands even more dramatically than they did here. Within the hour, Thomas had retrieved the original manuscript from its hiding place and navigated the long-forgotten tunnel beneath Oakenshield's northern wall. Michael Cooper led him through concealing woodlands to Raven's Cove, where a small fishing boat awaited. As Thomas boarded, the young man hesitated on the shore. What shall I tell the others, my lord? Those who remain at Oakenshield? Thomas considered, carefully before answering. Tell them that knowledge, once awakened, cannot truly be destroyed. Tell them that what we began at Oakenshield will continue elsewhere, growing stronger until it can no longer be suppressed. The boat pushed away from shore, carrying Thomas and the ancient manuscript toward an uncertain future. From the water, he could see smoke rising over Oakenshield, Reynolds' men burning the green manure crops and special compost heaps, attempting to eradicate all traces of the prohibited methods. Yet even as they destroyed the physical implementation, they could not undo what had been accomplished. The soil at Oakenshield had been renewed. Seeds from the ancient varieties had already been surreptitiously distributed among trusted farmers throughout the region. Most importantly, the knowledge itself survived, preserved in the manuscript Thomas carried and in the memories of those who had worked with the ancient methods. 5 years later, a prosperous agricultural settlement flourished in the Western Territories, far beyond the reach of Lord Richardson's influence. At its centre stood a modest manor house where Thomas Blackwood, now known simply as Thomas the Farmer, instructed a new generation in the agricultural techniques once forbidden in the Eastern Kingdoms. The settlement had grown rapidly as word spread of its extraordinary productivity. Displaced farmers, second sons without inheritance, and families seeking better futures journeyed to join the community that had become known for its abundance and equitable distribution of resources. On this particular autumn day, Thomas stood in the central teaching garden with 24 students gathered around him, young men and women from various backgrounds united by their desire to learn the ancient agricultural wisdom. The soil is not merely dirt, Thomas explained, echoing Brother Samuel's words from years ago. It is a living system, a complex community of creatures too small for our eyes to see, yet critical to all that grows. He demonstrated the specialized composting technique, explaining how different materials contributed unique elements to create what they now called living soil. The students took careful notes, asking questions that demonstrated their growing understanding of principles once deemed too dangerous for common knowledge. As the lesson concluded, a rider approached from the settlement's eastern boundary. Thomas recognized Michael Cooper, who had joined the settlement 3 years earlier after fleeing increasing persecution in the northern provinces. "They're here," Michael announced as he dismounted. "Just crossed the river valley." Thomas nodded, a mixture of emotions crossing his face. After dismissing his students, he walked with Michael toward the settlement's main gate. In the distance, a small caravan approached, wagons and riders moving slowly along the dusty road. "How many?" Thomas asked. 37, Michael reported. "Mostly families from Oakenshield and neighboring estates. Baron Thornfield's new tax policies forced many to abandon their holdings. And my sister, any word?" Michael's expression softened. "One of the travelers claims to have seen her at Harvest Festival 2 months ago, still at Oakenshield, Still managing what remains of the estate under Crown supervision, Thomas absorbed this information with measured relief. Eleanor had survived the aftermath of his escape, though Oakenshield remained under Crown control. Perhaps someday, when their settlement grew strong enough, reconciliation might be possible. The arriving caravan brought more than just new settlers. It carried seeds saved from the original plantings at Oakenshield, preserved despite Reynolds's efforts to eradicate them. It brought individuals who remembered the transformation they had witnessed, how depleted fields had flourished when ancient wisdom was applied. Most importantly, it brought stories of how the ancient techniques had continued to spread quietly throughout the northern provinces despite official prohibition. What had begun with a forbidden manuscript discovered beneath a monastery floor had become a movement that could no longer be contained. The knowledge once suppressed for political control now flowed like water, nourishing communities far beyond its origin. As Thomas welcomed the newest arrivals to their settlement, he reflected on Brother Samuel's words years ago. Knowledge that should flow like water, restricted, it stagnates, shared, it nourishes all it touches. The ancient agricultural wisdom had indeed transformed Thomas from a disgraced knight into the richest man in his new kingdom, though his wealth was measured not in gold or titles, but in fertile soil, abundant harvests, and the flourishing community that grew from them. And that, Thomas had come to understand, was the truest form of wealth that any man could possess. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.